So, hello there, guys. In this session, we're going to be looking at cell biology, a new topic that we're going to be trying to teach you guys to give you the head start that's needed for Key Stage 4 for next year. We're going to start with a do now for you guys to kind of recap some of the questions that have come up in previous topics, kind of get you guys thinking about science. These questions should hopefully kind of reflect on some of the stuff that's going to come up as well. So talking about subatomic particles, that might actually feature a little bit in this session. What I'm going to ask you guys to do is to pause the video here. I would then like you to attempt these questions. Give yourselves a couple of minutes, have your best go. When you've attempted every single question, press play on the video and have a look at this next slide for me then, guys. So pause it now. So here's some of the answers for you guys. Now, the first three ones are based on one of the recent topics in biology, talking about biological molecules, things like carbohydrates, proteins, lipids. That first question, organisms, you might have heard of that word before, and hopefully you have in regards to living things. When we talk about protons, neutrons, and electrons, and this idea of a nucleus, that features a little bit in this session as well. There is a bit of a crossover where words are similar in the different science topics. So for example, the nucleus, we're talking about the center of an atom. Within this topic, nucleus has a slightly different meaning, but kind of means the same thing. So it's a little bit familiar for you guys, okay? So pause the video now, just mark your answers for me, and then we'll continue with this session. Our objectives for today is I want students to be able to state what we mean by the term cell. This is the topic of cell biology, so hopefully by the end of this session we'll know what we mean by a cell. We should be able to identify organelles. Now don't worry if you don't know what that word means yet. I'll do a little bit of a keyword summary in a moment. And students will be able to explain the difference between plants and animal cells. So those are our objectives for today. Let's kind of have a bit think about as we go through this session. Now, the three key words that I've picked out from this topic to get us started with is this idea of organisms, cells, and organelles. Now, it might be an idea to note some of this stuff down just to kind of get a bit of familiarity with writing those words. Spelling can be quite important for things like organism and organelle. So try and practice your spellings a little bit with them. We don't want to accidentally spell a different word. Spelling's not always massively important. We'd obviously like you to be able to spell properly, but if you accidentally spell a different word, then we can't give you the marks for it, so be careful with that. You'll notice that the words organism and organelle are kind of similar in terms of their letters, so you want to be really careful with that. Now, an organism is the name we give to any living thing. So that could be humans, it can be tigers, it can be cheetahs, it can be plants, it can be trees. It could also be things like bacteria, funguses, parasites, all of those kind of things. They are living things, so they are called an organism. Now, organisms are made up of cells, the smallest part of an organism, so they're microscopic. So in order to actually see these, you will need a microscope as well to see them. Organelles are the parts that make up a cell. So a little bit, you'll see the word organ is within that word organelle. They're kind of like the organs of a cell, and each one has a particular job that enables that cell to survive and grow. So those are our keywords for the topic. Just kind of be familiar with those words. If you see them and they're still a little bit confused, come back to this little bit here, this part of the video, and kind of familiarize yourself with it. Now, giving you kind of a really rough definition of what a cell is. Cells make up organisms. So you, me, every living thing that you see is made up of cells. Some organisms are made up of only one cell, and they've got a bit of a fancy name called unicellular organisms. So things like bacteria, funguses, they are unicellular organisms made of one cell. However, most of the living things that you have seen or come into contact with are what we call multicellular, so many cells. Often when we say many cells, we're talking about billions and trillions of cells making up what you can see today. We mentioned it earlier that cells are microscopic. to be able to see you and me, we can see each other. We're made of many, many millions and billions of cells. Now, the first type of cell we need to be familiar with is this idea of an animal cell. Now, I always think it looks, excuse me, I always think it looks a little bit like a cookie kind of shape. You've got all the kind of chunks within this circular shape. Now, they're not always circular, but I've just kind of drawn it for you as this to try and make it as easy to kind of digest as possible. Now, I've labelled it each part of an animal cell that you need to be familiar with. In our next session, we'll talk about what each of those does. But for now, I want you guys to be able to identify and spot them. Can you tell me which organelle is which if I gave you a blank one and some arrows? That will be an exam question a little bit later on to kind of test that. It's the kind of thing they ask you in GCSE questions. Okay, so can you tell me what this arrow is pointing to, for example? Now, the biggest part of our cell, the bit that really probably stands out, is that really large black circle in the center. Now, they are a pretty massive part of the cell. They take up a lot of space, which is important for later. But we call that the nucleus. That word you will have heard of before in chemistry. A nucleus is normally the center of something. It's normally the most important part as well. It kind of keeps it all together. Within your nucleus, there's things like your DNA, but don't worry too much about that. It is normally the largest part inside of a cell. So if you look at a cell and you notice a really large dark space, that's probably the nucleus. Now, the outside of a cell, this kind of ring that I've done around the outside there, is what we call the cell membrane. And that kind of just keeps everything together, a little bit like the walls of a house. It keeps everything in the inside. It does control what enters and exits the cell as well. But for now, you just need to recognize that the outline of our cells is normally the cell membrane for animal cells. That longer word underneath is mitochondria. You might have to practice saying that a little bit. So if you want to take some time now and practice saying that word, mitochondria, don't worry too much about pronouncing it. But if you do know how to pronounce it, you'll feel more comfortable saying and writing that word down. Spelling for that word can look a little bit scary, but it's unlikely that you'll spell anything else by writing that out. So don't worry too much about it. Just practice the spellings a little bit. Practice pronouncing it so you're kind of confident in using that word. If you're looking at a cell and you see these kind of oval shapes, they're normally the mitochondria. They look a little bit like kidney beans sometimes as well. Underneath the mitochondria, these smaller black dots that are all spread throughout the cell is what we called ribosomes. Similar to mitochondria, practice saying that a little bit, but we call those ribosomes, black dots that are scattered all through the cell. It can be very difficult to spot them sometimes, so it's unlikely that they'll ask you to identify it if they gave you a blank picture. Normally it's things like mitochondria, nucleus, cell membrane. Underneath the ribosomes is this word cytoplasm. Now that's pointing to the empty space inside of the cell. Now it's not really empty. It's actually this jelly-like substance that kind of fills the inside of the cell. We call that the cytoplasm. Looks like an empty space, but it's not. It's just because it's see-through, a little bit like water. It's made of mostly water, but it's kind of see-through. It's important that you can spot each type of organelle. It is an exam question later on that will ask you to spot them. Okay, so look for that oval shape, look for the really dark, large circle inside of the cell, look for the outline, and if an arrow is pointing to an empty space, it's probably the cytoplasm. Okay. It would be a good idea now to maybe pause the video and spend a little bit of time practice drawing that out, maybe draw a little sketch of it out, have it on a wall somewhere to kind of be familiar with it. I'll be asking you to do that again later on, so don't spend too long doing that, but it's a good idea to practice drawing this. The next type of cell that you need to know about is plant cells. Now, the biggest organisms that you guys will see, the biggest living things, will either be an animal or it will be a plant. Sometimes you might see funguses, but they're different. Now, it's very similar to an animal cell. There are three key differences, though, three extra parts to a plant cell that an animal does not have. Now, they are called chloroplast, there's the permanent vacuole, and then there is the cell wall. Okay. Now, look for those differences on that diagram there of the plant cell. You'll notice there are some similarities. That large dark circle is the nucleus. The cytoplasm is the empty space. The mitochondria are smaller normally than the chloroplast, right? But they're normally a different colour as well. They'll normally be a green colour, but I couldn't find a green diagram for you, okay? So the three key differences is chloroplast, they're normally green. They're what makes the plant green. The permanent vacuole is like a sac within inside of the cell, and then the cell wall is this outside wall next to the cell membrane. I'd like to take a little bit of time now, 5-10 minutes, having a go at this activity. So a good idea to use your pen and your pencil, draw it out on a bit of paper, label the plant animal cells below, then add mitochondria and ribosomes to each of them. Label the following parts of each cell where appropriate. So kind of draw it out, label it as best as you can, and then compare it to the diagrams earlier on. Pause the video now and take about 5-10 minutes to have a go at that. You should have access to an exam question either on the Dropbox or it's kind of been printed. You've got access to a copy of it, but it should be there on the Dropbox for you guys to have a go at. So for this exam question, I'd like to have a go at it. It can be found on a distance learning Dropbox alongside this PowerPoint. Okay, have a go at those questions. The questions are all focused on spotting the different parts of a cell. Okay, those organelles that we've been having a little bit of a practice on identifying. Once you've done that exam question, these are some kind of final thoughts to finish off this little clip looking at cell biology, at cells. It's a good idea to practice drawing these cell diagrams so that you're comfortable with spotting the different parts of it. I would then like you, once you've done the exam question and everything else alongside this video, there are some questions on Educake for you to have a go at as well. So make sure you have a look at those questions for me. Thank you very much, guys.